Hey guys, so today, as you can quickly see if you're watching on video on the Vertex YouTube channel, I am by myself. The Mazda Miata has never gotten better gas mileage as it has today. Me alone in the car, top down, cruising towards Tonetown. Today, I wanted to talk to you guys about something that has come up across two calls even just today with customers, but more recently it's come up, I would say, with renewed vigor, and that is around everything signal chain, but specifically what I wish I would have known early on in my pedalboard days when I was planning out my own board builds and board builds for customers, and what I wish I would have spent more time on early on in the process. And that really is around the planning stages of a board build, and specifically testing out and putting in the hard work of planning out my signal chain rather than assuming what order the pedals should go in. Why not just do the tests and find out for yourself? And I think the interesting thing that came up in these recent phone calls I had is, yes, there is a starting point for signal chain, of which Vertex on their website has some great diagrams for different ways you can run your signal chain, but gives you a really good foundational starting point. What I really want to chat about today, though, is how to break the rules a little bit and aid in finding your own sound, your own tastes in signal chain. So I'm going to give you some really practical ways to go about this, tests that I would absolutely run. These are probably in the more common test type realm, but over and over again, I find that customers have just not either heard of these, considered them, or put in the work to try them. And I guarantee you, if you do these tests, you will understand your pedals, how they interact with each other, and essentially what your tastes are for signal chain a whole lot more. You're going to be able to bring a lot more to the conversation. And I know out of all of the things around the world today, pedal order is in the top 10 for sure. So we're going to cover that today. Before we get into it, since I am by myself, I can kind of do this. I'm going to get right into our first ad break. And specifically, the reason I want to do this is because our sponsor number one today is going to be able to provide almost all of these pedals for you. And that is at the Guitar Sanctuary. So I want to let you guys know about the guitarsanctuary.com. And the brick and mortar store is in McKinney, Texas. If you are ever in the area, you definitely want to check out Guitar Sanctuary. They sell Vertex, Goodwood audio, former home of Brian Omilion, and he's still close by in the area. So you could pick up some gear at the Guitar Sanctuary, drive down the road, and Brian can set it up for you. These guys sell incredible gear, great customer service via text, call, or in store, very knowledgeable and helpful. And the gear that we're chatting about today can be purchased at theguitarsanctuary.com or in person in McKinney, Texas. I also wanted to let you guys know about Neural DSP. And of course, a lot of you guys are familiar with the Quad Cortex. They're kind of multi-effects, amp sim type device, and you can capture all of your amps and some of your pedals. But the thing that I wanted to make you guys aware of, if you aren't already, is the fact that they are now slowly releasing plug-in capability on the Quad Cortex, which is a long-awaited feature, and we're here. We're living in good days. And so the Quad Cortex, now you can upload a few plugins that they have available, and they're only adding more with new and future updates. So check that out. Also, the Nano Cortex, another piece of hardware that Neural offers, is kind of a smaller form factor capturing device and multi-effect type unit that you can put on your board. It's a stripped back version of the Quad Cortex and about a quarter of the size and price. Not quite a quarter of the price, but it's $549 US for the Nano Cortex. Lastly, all of the plugins that you guys can find on neuraldsp.com, you can get 30% off with the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for plugins that are 90 days or older. So definitely check them out. Guitar Sanctuary and Neural DSP are our first two sponsors that make this podcast possible. So by supporting them, you are absolutely supporting us here at the podcast. let's get back into it. So the biggest signal chain hacks that I wish I would have known early on, and what I would not rush in planning out a board build. And I think, I don't know if I would take this to the grave, but pretty close. I would absolutely spend a disproportionate amount of time in planning my own board, and I advise other people to do the same, on trying out different signal chain orders. And the good thing about this is, yes, you'll need to rerun a couple of tests as you get new pedals, maybe new overdrives, but for the most part, if you try out these signal chain kind of different approaches and orders that I'm about to talk about today, you will have a much better knowledge for all future pedal board builds. This is not something that you need to do hours and hours and hours every single time you do a board build. It is growing your knowledge base in signal chain and how these pedals interact, and more importantly, what your tastes are as the guitar player. This is how you find your sound. This is how you grow in knowing how pedals are going to react with each other, pedals on your board, other people's pedals on their board, where you like your compressor in the chain versus your boost or EQ. All of these things will play a pretty integral part, rather than just going by the general wisdom and just assuming that that's what you like best. I guarantee it is not, because you need to try the stuff out for yourself. So my biggest recommendation here, I know I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit, but you just got to put in the work. If this is something you take seriously and you love your pedal board and the sounds it allows you to create, you love creating music on guitar, then put in the work for signal chain. So let's get into the first one. And the first one on my list today is really around fuzz. And this is probably more a question I get rather than a best practice. A lot of you guys know that fuzz should be up first in your signal chain. And what I mean by that is, if you are going to be plugging your guitar into a pedal, it should be a fuzz. And if you don't use fuzz on your board, just ignore this. If you are plugging into a patch bay, make sure the patch bay is passive. It does not have a buffer in it, and that is essentially the same as plugging straight into the fuzz. The reason that we do this, and I know we've talked about this before on the podcast, but the majority of fuzzes like to see the guitar pickups. Basically, they like to see the cable plugged straight from the guitar right into the fuzz itself. If you have a buffer first, let's say you have a tuner that has a buffer always on, and you go guitar into tuner into the fuzz. Now the fuzz is seeing the buffer. It's going to sound different, to say the least, probably not better depending on your tastes. It'll probably sound a little bit kind of farty, flabby. You won't get all the definition that you would like to hear out of your guitar signal in most cases. And so fuzz up first is a very common one, and one that I wouldn't necessarily recommend chucking later in your chain, although I wouldn't go past saying that you shouldn't test it. You should know what it sounds like when your fuzz is coming after a buffer. There are times where you're going to plug things in and you aren't going to realize that it has a buffered bypass, so a buffer's in your chain no matter what. And you're going to think to yourself, man, my fuzz doesn't sound like what it should or what I'm used to. And you will know that sound. Oh, there's a buffer somewhere before my fuzz. And so you'll know right away that you need to readjust your signal chain, and you'll be able to do it quickly. And you won't be emailing the company that makes the fuzz pedal saying what's wrong. You'll actually know right away that there's a buffer somewhere in your signal chain. So fuzz up first is kind of a really great starting point. Again, not all fuzzes have to see the guitar pickup. So that's why I would say run this test. And if you do that, you'll know the sound very quickly and you'll be able to move on from there. I forgot that I should probably share my screen with you guys here. So let me share. I have something up on Pedal Playground, a great website, not a sponsor, but yet still a really great website for practicing, messing around with, playing with your layouts here. And so let me share my screen so you can see what I'm working with. So this is another, for me, just a fun way to get pedals that I really enjoy using up all on one screen. And Brian and Mason can't do anything about it. So one of my favorite, I wouldn't say my all-time favorite, but one of my favorite fuzz pedals is the Apocalypse by Death by Audio. Such a fun pedal, sounds huge, great fuzz. So I would put that up first. And then after that, let's get into boost position. Now, I don't have a typical boost on here, but I figure we could cover a few things in one go because my list of all of the signal chain hacks I wanted to talk about just got longer and longer the more I sat down and thought this through. So we're kind of doing boost and EQ in one, and I'll just talk about them at the same time. So we have the Source Audio EQ2, and this is basically a preset-based EQ. You can run it in pre-post, meaning you can run it in two different spots in your signal chain if you're okay with mono. And it's MIDI controllable. There's a whole bunch of cool things about the Source Audio EQ2. On the screen, though, currently for those listening, I have the EQ2 after the overdrives, after pitch, and that is one of two places that you'd typically put it. You could argue that you could put it much later in your chain as well, but I would say out of the most common ones, you could put your boost pedal before your overdrives, not before your fuzz necessarily, before your overdrives. So I'm just moving it before the Bondi Effects sick as. You could put it before your overdrives, and now you are EQing more of your guitar signals. So this is a great place to put it if you want to tame or enhance or affect some of the EQs on your guitar. Maybe it's a little bright, you want to roll those off. You could do that with, excuse me, with an EQ here. As a boost, it's going to be a little bit different. And you can think about running a hotter signal into your overdrives versus a hotter or boosted signal after your overdrives. If we think about this practically, some things are going to change. If we run a boost into a section of overdrives, you are going to get more clipping. So you are going to get more saturation, more of that overdriven sound if you run the boost before your overdrives. But let's say now you don't change a single thing. You're still boosting your signal by a few dB, but all you do, the only change you make is you move that boost to after your overdrives. The only thing that has changed is signal chain, but the sound is going to be very, very different. Now, instead of getting more saturation, more overdriven sound, by moving your boost after the overdrives, you are now going to get more level. You are going to get louder. That wasn't so much the case when you move the boost before the overdrives. So it's a very big difference. And again, with the EQ2, you could technically run this before your overdrives and after by way of patching it in correctly, and then create presets where that boost is going to show up per preset. But in this case, let's say we have a standard boost pedal. Where do you run it, before or after? Well, when you hit the boost, do you want it to get more overdriven or do you want it to get a bit louder? And typically, I would say this is not right or wrong, but the most common is putting it after the overdrives. And the biggest takeaway, which will be the same takeaway for just about everything here, is again, it's not right or wrong. It's just knowing that this is going to happen, that there is a difference, that you need to consider the placement, not just picking or finding your favorite boost pedal, but where is it going to go in the signal chain on my pedal board? That is just as important as the type of pedal that you choose to put there. So boost before, after overdrives, that is kind of one of the first. I know we talked about the fuzz, but that's really more about thinking about buffers. Where are you going to put your boost, early or late, before or after overdrives? Similarly with EQ, we're kind of talking about that at the same time. Do you want to shape your EQ before it hits your overdrives, and then the overdrives are then going to do their own number on your EQ after that? Or do you want to run guitar into your overdrives and then tame some of the highs or boost some of the mids or scoop? Like, you can kind of think about this a few different ways. I would say, again, the most common is probably EQ much later in your chain after your overdrives. But by no means is this right or wrong. If I had a super bright guitar, I would run the test. I would say, or I would set up my pedals on the floor and I would rearrange things really quickly and sloppily, but it's great for quick signal chain changes. It's just put everything on the floor and get to work. And I would try taming the highs of my guitar and then run it into my overdrives versus run a bright guitar into all my overdrives and then tame it after that. These are going to result in slightly different sounds. So again, neither one is right or wrong, but you need to do the tests and see what you like, what sounds better to your ear, what sounds better into your amp setup and your guitar pedal combination. So there's a lot to consider, even just with boost and EQ. The next one I wanted to chat about is pitch. And I think a lot of you guys, I'm just moving the octave here right before the overdrives, but after the fuzz. I have a Pico Pog just because I was running out of space on screen here. But I think Electro Harmonics does a great octave style pedal. And if you like octaves, again, you need to decide where it's going to end up in your signal chain. Something I haven't really chatted about yet, but will really apply for the majority of these tests, kind of a way of thinking about signal chain, one of many. But the later a pedal is in your signal chain, the more it will affect your signal. So what do I mean by that? If we have the Pog as an example, right now it goes guitar, which is the purple box. If you're watching on the Vertex YouTube channel, the purple box on the right-hand side, that represents guitar if you can't quite see it, then into fuzz, then into the Pog, then overdrives. If we put the Pog where it is now, before the overdrives, we turn it on, it's going to sound like an octave sound. Let's say we have an overdrive or two on. We have that octave sound coming through, and that octave sound is being overdriven by the overdrives that come later in the signal chain. The octave is going to be very clearly audible. It's going to sound great. You're going to get great comments from everyone in the audience. How did you sound like you're playing bass and guitar at the same time? Don't tell them. Just say you've been really practicing a lot, and it's nice to hear that it's been paying off. But if you took that same compliment from the audience, tipped your hat, said thank you, but now you move your Pog to after your overdrives, before the boost in this instance, after overdrives, you could do it after boost as well, run that test, see what happens. Let's say it's after the overdrives, but you have not changed a single setting on the Pog. You were just changing signal chain. It is going to sound like you increased the mix of the Pog. You added more octave effect simply by changing where it is in your signal chain. Is that better? Is it worse? I don't know. Run the test and see what you think. See what sounds better to your ears, to the presets that you create, to the sounds and the ways that you like running your overdrive and your octave. See which one sounds better to you. So this would be the second most common, I would say, that comes up as far as signal chain. Where do I run my Pog? And a lot of people will just say a blanket, run it as early in the chain as possible, which usually means after your fuzz, maybe after a wah. But I would like to challenge that whenever, and I was saying this to a customer today on the call, whenever someone says or talks in absolutes when it comes to signal chain, and really in many areas in life, I start stepping back a little bit and just taking whatever they say with a very large grain of salt. Because so much of this is personal taste. And even when you hear, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, but you hear a guitar track in isolation and it sounds purposefully thin or something purposefully exaggerated, like a huge filter, a massive over-exaggerated mid-scoop has been put on this guitar. And frankly, it sounds terrible. And then you hear that same guitar track in the context of the song and it fits perfectly. This is kind of where I sit in the signal chain debate. You can't really judge someone's guitar sound solely on the guitar in isolation. And you will make a whole bunch of assumptions, and I'm guilty of this myself. I've made a whole bunch of assumptions on someone's guitar tone listening to it in isolation, and then I hear it in the context of which or where they play, and it's a very different experience. And so the same goes with everything that we're going to be chatting about today, is you need to play these sounds, experiment with them, see what sounds good to your ear, and you will know the context in which you're going to use these things. And so you can't really go by general one-size-fits-all wisdom on signal chain. You have to experiment. And I'm going to make myself sick of how many times I'm going to say that today. You need to experiment and find that sound. So with the Pog, again, neither one is right or wrong. Do you put it before overdrives? Do you put it after overdrives? Are you daring enough to try it at the very end of your chain? See what you like, see what sounds best for your context and what you like to play. And you'll come up with some new sounds, I promise you, that you haven't heard before. So for now, I'll just put the Pog early in the chain. I personally, on my pedal board, if I put a Pog on it, I put it after overdrives. That's where I like it. I enjoy it. Sounds good to me. I think if to my ears, that is where I prefer an octave sound, is overdrive feeding the octave rather than octave feeding my overdrives. And that's one of the ones I really enjoy. Another very common one is the order of overdrives. And I'll say this first. If you aren't stacking overdrives, and what I mean by that is if you aren't running multiple overdrives at the same time, overdrive order is really negligible. Really the only thing that comes up at that point is it buffered bypass or not? If they're all true bypass overdrives, then you don't really have to worry about the order of the overdrives if you aren't stacking them, running multiples at the same time. If you are stacking them, then you need to get to work on testing them. A common starting place is lowest gain to highest gain. Another common starting place, which again, I've experimented with this myself, and depending on my overdrives, I like different results, is highest gain to lowest gain. So I know Mason often talks about starting with lowest gain to highest, and I don't disagree with that. I have experimented on certain boards and I've done highest into lowest and really enjoyed the results. But the common kind of, I guess, thought, and I know Mason has talked about this on the podcast, is that if you put the highest gain first, you can feed too much level, too much clipping or saturation into a lower gain pedal that might not sound as good with that much drive feeding into its input. So depending on how you use them, you might like lowest into highest, you might like highest into lowest. It's really up to you. For me, I really like the Sick As, which is kind of a modified clone with a great EQ. I really like that early in my chain, and I like it feeding into my TS9. I love having a TS9 on the board. These are two different circuits, and as far as the Sick As and the TS9, two very different circuits, and I like what it does. I usually run the Sick As quite flat, and I use it just as a bit of kind of a tone shaper. And then I get into the TS9 when I really want to stand out and make a statement. And then lastly, we have the DRV, 1981 DRV, which is essentially a Rat, but a little bit more tame. So it's a bit more up my alley. So you could picture that as a Rat if you're into distortions, or a DS1 by Boss. And the Rat I have at the end here. And again, the Rat we could just move this around here. For those listening, I'm just putting the Rat before the Sick As and then Sick As into TS9. Or again, we could modify this further. We could do the Sick As into the 1981 DRV into the TS9. And I would run all of these experiments to see which one I like best. And again, this really depends on what pedals you're going to have on at the same time. If I'm only ever going to have the DRV on by itself, and I'm never going to have the Sick As or TS9 on with the DRV, the placement of the DRV doesn't really matter as much. But if I'm going to do combinations, Sick As and DRV, Sick As and TS9, TS9 and DRV, then the order does matter and it will drastically change. Going back to what I was saying earlier, the latest pedal, or the pedal last in the overdrive signal chain, Sick As, TS9, DRV. Let's say we just went nuts and we turned all three of these on. The signal will sound most like, not exactly like, but most like the DRV. You would probably think to yourself, oh, that's a really saturated DRV or Rat style sound. Whereas if I kept everything the same, didn't change any settings, but changed the order. Let's say we did TS9 last, and it was Sick As DRV into TS9, and then we turned all three pedals on. Now you would probably say, oh, it's a little bit more tube screamerish, but it sounds a little too overdriven. I wonder what's going on. And that would be, it would take on the characteristics mostly of the TS9, but with more saturation, obviously, because we're just going nuts on overdrive and what is all turned on at the same time. So overdrives, again, I would personally, my personal opinion, I would say you need to try out the combinations if you're stacking overdrives and see which one sounds best to you into your rig and go from there. So overdrives, high gain to lowest, lowest to highest, a total mix up of, gain level doesn't actually matter and you're just trying different combinations. You will find different sounds that you like, and you will find a whole bunch of different variations and sound options just by changing the order. And all of this, I have to say, with our EQ being on screen right now, you'll probably have to slightly change your EQ presets based on the overdrive order that you select. Because it will sound a lot different. If you put the TS9 last, you're going to have more of a mid scoop, and you might not want that accentuated quite as much on your EQ. So you might change the EQ if the TS9 is last versus if the DRV is last or the sick as. Hopefully this is making sense so far. I don't have too many more of these, but signal chain, I think people underestimate how drastic it will affect your sound and how many combinations you can actually have in your signal chain. So it's just one of the things I love chatting about, but I think the majority of you are, why does this guy care so much about signal chain? I think it's more powerful than buying a new pedal to try and get a sound. I think you can get a lot of sounds that you're after, especially in the gain territory, just by changing the order of the pedals you already own. I know that's less exciting, and I'd much rather buy a pedal with you, but just mess around with signal chain before you go out and buy a pedal and tell me what the results are. After that, so we've been through, we talked about fuzz, we talked about boost, a bit about EQ and overdrives. Now let's get into volume placement. Again, this is one that we have chatted about a bit on the podcast, but just to highlight the important aspects here, you can put your volume anywhere you want, really, but there are two main areas that come up that I see over and over again, and that is volume first or early in your chain, let's say before overdrives, or volume after your overdrives. Where is it best suited? And depending on what you like to hear, this is going to change how the volume sounds and reacts with your pedals, and ultimately what sound comes out of your amp. So let's pretend this volume was early on. This is, again, anyone that's listened for more than 5 minutes knows that the Layla mono volume is my favorite. The mono volume S is on screen. It's buffered or active, so I'm going to put it after the fuzz pedal. So let's say it's early in your chain. So right now we have fuzz into volume into octave and then overdrives. If we pull back the volume, let's say you're into doing volume swells, we pull back the volume pedal and we go halfway. So volume level has come down and we feed that dropped or attenuated signal into our overdrives. We are going to be treating this just as if our volume pot on our guitar has been rolled back. And what happens when you roll back a volume pot on your guitar? Your overdrives clean up, which basically means that they sound like you turned the drive knob down. And if we do that with a volume pedal, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently right about that. It's just what happens. So if you do a swell and you're going from volume all the way off, you hit a chord on your guitar and then you bring that volume pedal up, it's going to sound clean on the first half of that volume pedal, kind of moving from off to on. And then on the last half, you're going to start hearing the overdrive or the clipping of the overdrive pedals start to come into effect. So it's going to be a clean on the bottom of the swell into turning up your overdrive's gain knob again. And again, neither right or wrong. My argument here to why you would not do that is if you want to do that kind of swell and you're up for practicing the technique with your hand, you can just do that on your guitar's volume pot and you can clean up the guitar by pulling the volume pot on your guitar back, and then you can dirty it up again or get more overdrive saturation by turning that guitar volume up. If there's a reason why that does not work for you, maybe you just like using your foot and you like the sound of it, then put your volume pedal early. But if you want to have a volume swell, and now on screen I'm just moving my volume to after the overdrives later in the chain, if you like having a volume swell that is fully overdriven or clipped the whole way through, which is my personal preference, then you want to move your volume after. And if you think about this logically, you're playing, let's say a chord, and the overdrives, which are a couple of them, let's say, are turned on. Let's say I have the sick as and the TS9 turned on. Those overdrive pedals are seeing the full strength of the guitar signal because there's nothing reducing that signal. So your signal goes through the fuzz, it goes through the octave, the overdrives, and it is fully clipping that signal because they are getting the full level on their inputs of the overdrive inputs. Then we go through, let's say, the boost pedal into the volume if we're looking on screen here, and then we pull back the volume. So the signal has already been fully saturated by the overdrives, and then we pull back the volume. So now when we pull back the volume at its lowest point, right before off, you are getting full overdrive, but at a lower volume level. So now the signal has been attenuated, but with full saturation from the overdrives. So now when you do a swell, you're getting all the clipping through the full level, or the full sweep, I should say, of that volume pedal. This is probably more common in church context. So you'll hear a lot of kind of swell stuff like this. It's just you get the full texture the whole way through. If you're into ambient music, again, this is a very common way to run your volume pedal. If you just like using your foot to clean up your guitar, again, you can put it early. But I'd say if you're into swelling your guitar sound, you want to at least try it after your overdrives if you haven't already, because it is, again, a big difference. And again, you could put volume, if you just do a bit of a thought exercise here, what if you put your volume at the very end of your chain? So now it's after your reverb and after your delay. I'm just moving this around on screen to reflect this. Now, if you think logically, what's going to happen? When you pull back the volume pedal, you are going to be reducing the overall level before it hits the amp. So the reverb trails, the delay repeats, those are going to get cut off entirely. It's going to act as a master mute if you pull that volume pedal back. And then if you swell in, you're going to get the repeats and the decay of the reverb also trailing in. And it's just going to sound like someone's turning you off at front of house, or turning the volume off on your guitar amp and swelling you back in. Whereas if the volume pedal is before delay and reverb and you do that same swell, then now when you pull the volume back quickly, you're going to still hear the repeats and the decay of the reverb. It's going to sound a bit more natural. And it'll, I guess, I don't know, I don't want to throw around the word, it's going to sound a bit more musical. But to my ears, without trying to sound like I'm leading the witness here, I just think it sounds better. And that's kind of why the general accepted way to run a volume pedal isn't at the end of the chain, but it's either after or before overdrives, is just because those wet effects will sound prematurely cut off if you run that volume pedal after them. If you've never thought about that, then that's kind of the reasoning for it. And I think it's just fun to experiment. Why don't people run overdrives after reverb? Why don't they run, a volume pedal after their reverb? Try it out and see what happens, and you'll probably very quickly find out why. It just, the sound isn't maybe what our ears are used to as far as guitar sounds and all that. So we have volume. Where should you run your volume? And you can run it before overdrives, after overdrives, at the end of your pedal board, somewhere in between. Experiment and see what happens. Really quickly, I would say another question here is, where would we run a volume if you're running an amp effects loop or if you're running an amp sim? And I think a great place, if you're running an amp effects loop, presumably you're running your amp pretty hot. You're using it for gain, but the overdrive sounds, a channel switching amp. And so the natural place to run a volume pedal, if you like running it after overdrives, is running it in your amp's effects loop, or after the preamp out or the effects send of your amp is where your volume could go, because the preamp of your amplifier in that case is really acting kind of like a overdrive. So that applies to EQ, possibly even to boost, and you can run those experiments as well. Then we get into amp sim, which I've kind of already mentioned. A lot of people, as far as I've mentioned already, as far as treating it like an amp in regards to your volume, but a lot of people run their amp sim at the end of their chain, which is totally fine. You will notice a difference if you run it after your overdrives, but before your modulation. So in this instance right now on screen, I have it right before the volume pedal, but after all of the overdrives, after the boosts. And I think that could be a good case for it. I guess the pro to running it, if you have an amp sim that has a headphone out, the pro to running it after reverb is that your headphone out will then get all of your wet effects. Typically, it won't sound quite as good though. So the downside to running an amp sim before your reverb delay modulation is that your headphone out is only going to send out of the headphone out what comes before it. So in this case, before the amp sim, we have the fuzz, we have the POG, the octave, we have overdrives, EQ, and boost. And so that's the only thing that is going to come out of your headphone out. But when you use it live or when you use it for tracking or recording, it's probably going to sound a little bit better earlier in the chain. So you need to decide what is of higher value and run these tests. You may disagree. You may say it sounds way better at the end of the chain after my reverb and delay. And this does change per amp sim. So I remember doing tests early on. This may have changed with updates, but early on I tested Iridium and did a lot of tests with Iridium before modulation and after delay and reverb. And for me, it was a standout winner. Iridium sounded better before my modulation effects, not at the end of my chain. But then I did similar tests with Walrus ACS1, and that it wasn't as clear of a winner. I think I still liked it before modulation, but it wasn't night and day. I could have very easily put at the end of my chain and been very happy with the headphone out at the end of my chain and, accessing some of those features at the end without feeling like I was sacrificing the sound quality of the amp sim by putting it late in my chain. And again, this has probably changed with updates from Strymon on the Iridium, but it does make a difference where you place it in the chain. My starting point, not where I necessarily end up, but my starting point is putting it after overdrives and before modulation. And you can treat this as your amp. So again, you could very easily put EQ after your amp sim. You could put it before your amp sim. Same with boost. You could, if you're especially running your amp sim with overdriven channel switching style sounds, you could very easily put EQ, boost, and volume after your amp sim and make a great case for it. But again, try it out, see what you think, see what the sounds are like. Into modulation effects. Again, there are a ton of different options that we could cover here. Before we get into modulation, though, I want to go into our last ad break and chat about two more people that make the podcast possible. And the first is Mono Creators, or monocreators.com. Mono makes, hands down, my favorite soft bags for guitar and some of my favorite pedalboard accessories. So for guitar and soft bags for even pedal boards, they just don't break. They are lightweight, easy to move around, but still offer protection for my instruments and my pedal boards. And so for Mono Creators and their soft bags, it's really the only recommendation in my mind and has been for the last 10 to 15 years. As far as pedal board accessories, they have a great low profile pedal power supply. So isolated outputs, high current, switchable voltages, fits just about anywhere on any low profile pedal board because it's so thin. And I really also enjoy their angled pedal boards because they are, again, very strong, very lightweight, but they have some extra height in comparison with something like maybe a pedal train. They have additional height underneath where I can fit junction boxes. Maybe I want to fit an extra pedal that I don't need to touch while I'm playing live, an always on pedal or a MIDI controlled pedal. There's ample room underneath for me to mount it there where there wouldn't be on other angled equivalents. So really, I'm a big fan of Mono. You guys know this, but you can go to their website, monocreators.com, use the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 10% off your order, and you will be very happy with the quality and the thoughtfulness that they put into their gear. I also, lastly, want to tell you guys about Bestronix, or btpa.com. If you need to finish off your pedal board build, you need to check out Bestronix, whether you need bulk cable, connectors, you need advice from Brad, maybe you need some D-socket connectors that hold maybe a USB through or a power con through, something like that. Bestronix is going to be able to help you out and make sure that you can get your board finished and get it finished right. So if you need any parts, accessories, additional extras to finish the board, check out btpa.com and use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off your order. Tell Brad the Chairman sent you, and we'll see if we can crack a smile on Brad's face. And if he's sick of hearing from us yet, I talk to him most weeks, and so far he's never turned me away. So ask for Brad and he'll help you out and get you the part numbers that you need. So let's get back into it here, into modulation effects. There are less here, so we are getting close to the end. As far as my favorite / most common pedal that I get asked about, where should it be and what test should I run? hands down, it's tremolo. And I think a lot of people don't think about what will happen if they change out their tremolo position. And if you're not into tremolo, you just got to try this one because it's really fun. If you have multi-effects, then give this a shot. But tremolo before delay and reverb or tremolo after delay and reverb, there's no right or wrong. There is a drastic difference. And if, again, you think about this logically, we are running, let's say, a guitar signal, chorus into tremolo, into delay, into reverb. Tremolo, delay, and reverb are turned on. We are adjusting the level of the tremolo or the guitar signal, via the tremolo. So signals going up and down with a sine wave trem and feeding the delay and the reverb. Reverb and delay by default have, they are wet effects that trail on after the initial attack of the note. After the note hits their input, the delay will have a repeat for however many times you set it, and the reverb will decay. And the reason I point that out so obviously, and why is this guy telling us so many obvious facts here, wasting my time, is these repeats and the decay of the reverb are going to slightly fill in the gaps of the tremolo. So as the tremolo goes down in volume, the repeats and decay of the reverb are going to stay a little bit more consistent and fill in that gap. It's not going to be as obvious that the tremolo is even on. And so if you like a subtle movement, then you can put the tremolo before your delay and reverb and it'll have a certain sound or effect on your tone. Again, if we take the same tremolo without changing its settings, no settings changed on delay or reverb, and we move it to the very end of the chain, as you see on screen here, if you're watching on the Vertex YouTube channel, then now when that tremolo dips and the repeats and decay are coming before the tremolo, so they've already affected the signal, and then we're dropping the level, it's the same as that volume pedal example at the end of your chain. It's going to drop that level as low as the tremolo is set to go as far as volume or intensity, and then it'll bring it back up. The repeats and delay are no longer, repeats and decay, are no longer filling in the gaps. The tremolo is affecting the global volume of the pedal board with its sine wave. And so, or square wave, if you want to go absolutely crazy and hear a chopper style tremolo. So the placement of this is very significant. Maybe one of the most obvious changes that we will talk about today is the position of your tremolo. And so again, neither one is right or wrong, but you want to try out both. And in my case, I mean, my struggle is if I don't have something that can reorder tremolo to the very end of my chain to before delay and reverb, then I have to choose one, but I really do like both sounds. And so I struggle to pick here. If I can't reorder, then I usually put tremolo last. And this would be similar to a tremolo being on an amp. So an amp-based tremolo is it will cut out everything in your signal, and you'll be able to get a more intense tremolo sound. Again, going back to something we chatted about earlier, the later an effect is in your signal chain, the more it will sound like that effect, or the more effect it will have on your sound. And the tremolo is a prime example of this. When tremolo is early, it sounds more like the reverb. When the tremolo is last, it sounds more like the tremolo. And this kind of stays consistent across signal chain choices throughout your pedal board. Lastly, delay into reverb or reverb into delay. Try it out. Tell me if you notice a difference. This is a much, much harder one to make a case for one way or another. The general accepted wisdom is delay always goes into reverb. I've run blind tests, and if you're not overdriving or using a super kind of saturated, as far as driven sound built into the reverb or delay, which you can do depending on your delay type, if you aren't getting into overdrive sounds with your specific delay and reverb presets, then I have struggled to tell the difference. And so I wanted to make a clear case. I remember trying to make a video of what should you do, delay into reverb or reverb into delay? And I was really hoping to debunk it in a video, and I was just struggling. I couldn't really tell the difference on the delay and reverb settings that I had at that time. And so I had someone comment and they made an explanation for, which I'm not smart enough to repeat here and make a good case for. But all that to say, try it, see if you notice a big difference. But the one thing I would say is if you have an order switcher, do it so you do not know what is going where, because I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, it definitely sounds better with delay into reverb. And then I ask if they were in control of the full test. Like if you can do an order switcher, close your eyes, hit it a bunch of times so you lose track of what the order is, and then listen, I think you will struggle to tell the difference. See what you find though. I mean, tell me, put into words what you hear, and if you can put clear words to it, I will definitely try and replicate the test here, because I really do want to hear a difference on clear delay repeats and a standard room reverb as an example, but I struggle to do so. This is obviously assuming that you are doing dry through and everything, and you aren't skewing this test in any way. And then lastly, I mean, if we're getting into final tests here, we haven't even talked about parallel effects, which is a whole nother realm of signal chain changes. In this example that you see on screen here, with tremolo running into delay, running into reverb, I would probably run delay and reverb in parallel. If you're asking what should I run in parallel and where, delay and reverb in parallel make the biggest difference for sure. But the big thing is you need to be able to run them in kill dry. And that is a whole nother conversation that we're not going to get into today. But the pedals I have on screen, the DD7 by Boss, is not able to run in kill dry. So it's not a great pedal for running parallel. Even with the mix maxed out, it's still passing dry signal. So for a parallel rig, a DD7 is not a great choice. I'd much rather go with a DD500. They're kind of Strymon timeline equivalent of a delay, a multi-effect style delay or multi-delay pedal. But that is a whole nother kettle of fish. I am an absolute fan of running parallel effects, especially in the wet section. But that is just not what today's video is about. Maybe we can do that another time and talk through best practices when you're running a parallel effects. But for today, I think this is about it. So signal chain, I would say remember some of the key things being the later the later a pedal or effect is in your signal chain, the more it will affect your overall sound or signal. That's kind of rule number one. Rule number two is break all the rules, including rule number one, I guess. And I would say just try the combinations, spend a disproportionate amount of time testing out order and signal chain in your board build. In your next board build, try a whole bunch of these combinations and see what you like best. And it will bring up more tests that you have than in mind. And like doing one test will ultimately lead to more that you didn't think about at the beginning. But the main ones that I would absolutely try is if you're using pitch, run pitch before and after gain. If you're using a boost pedal, run it before and after your overdrives. EQ, before and after overdrives. Compression, we haven't talked about compression. Try compression in 3 different spots. Right after your fuzz if you're using it, so early in your chain, pre-overdrive. Run it after your overdrives, and then just for fun, just because you can, try running it at the end of your chain as well. And see what it sounds like to run a compressor after your reverb. That's not really a common place to run it, and you'll probably find out why for good reason. But running it after your overdrives versus before, that is a very common 2 spots to try compressors. And I would say neither one is right or wrong. After your overdrives is more of a studio style approach. Before is probably more tailored towards guitar and compressing the guitar signal before it hits the bulk of your effects. And I've had great results doing both of these methods. So you can definitely get away with both, and it is more of a to taste type approach. And then other than that, I think just making sure you try these tests, see what you like, experiment, have fun. I don't think, and again, this is my opinion, there is no one right way to run a pedalboard signal chain. This is how great guitar tones are made, is by experimenting with pedal order and techniques, how you attack your guitar strings in this new pedal order versus fingerstyle versus a pedal order. There are so many combinations, it's endless. And this is how you're going to find the unique sounds that you like, really taking ownership over your pedal board and the pedals. Do not just go with what someone recommends because it's what they did. You need to try this out with your pedals, with your pedal combination, with your amps, with your guitars, and see what works best for your ear, and then go from there. I would love to hear in the comments your favorite pedal combinations and signal chain hacks that you like to do, and what has really worked for you that was unexpected in the past. Lastly, I would be forever grateful if you guys could leave a review on Apple Podcasts for this podcast. It really helps us get in front of more people like you. And all we ask is for an honest review, not 5 stars, a review that you think is deserving of this podcast and what we do here. And we are really trying to make pedal boards demystified and accessible and teach you guys, some of the struggles we've been through and come out the other side and save you guys the trouble. So hope this has been helpful. I know it has been very technical today, a little different from what we normally do. But if you enjoy this type of stuff, let us know, and we can always do more of it. And let us know what experiments you guys end up doing and what works for you, what was unexpected. Can't wait to hear from you. And we'll see you guys next week for another episode. Thanks.